It was a blazing summer afternoon, the kind where the sun seemed to sit directly on your shoulders, daring you to complain. In the distance, the low, guttural hum of a motorcycle sliced through the quiet. Heads turned as the sleek black bike cruised into view, its polished chrome glinting in the sunlight. At the helm was Marcus Kane, a man whose presence commanded attention, even without the roar of his Harley. Dressed in a weathered leather jacket adorned with patches and pins that hinted at his countless journeys, Marcus was more than just a biker. He was a storyteller on wheels, a man with miles of road under his boots and enough stories to fill libraries. But today, he was riding into a story no one would soon forget. Marcus wasn't just any biker. His reputation preceded him. He was known for being calm under pressure, always willing to lend a hand to stranded riders, and someone who believed that the open road was the great equalizer, where race, status, and titles faded into the background. But despite his optimism and love for the biker community, Marcus was no stranger to the sting of prejudice. Being a black man on the road, he had faced his fair share of cold stares at diners, unwelcome silence at gas stations, and the occasional sneer that dripped with thinly veiled hostility. He had learned to navigate those moments with grace, more for his own peace than for the comfort of others. But this ride was different. This ride was about confronting something head-on, and Marcus was ready. His destination was a small town tucked away in the deep south. The kind of town where time seemed to have stopped somewhere in the past, and old habits lingered in the air like stubborn smoke. Marcus had heard whispers about a gathering, a local biker rally that was infamous for being anything but welcoming to outsiders, especially someone like him. Most would have steered clear, chalking it up to a fight that wasn't worth the trouble. But Marcus wasn't most people. As he rolled into town, the hum of his engine dropped into a low purr, turning more heads than he expected. The streets were lined with weathered storefronts, faded American flags fluttering above cracked sidewalks, and the occasional cluster of locals who stopped what they were doing to watch him pass. Some nodded politely, others looked away quickly, as though his presence alone disrupted some unspoken balance. Marcus kept his eyes forward, his posture relaxed, but his mind alert. Every instinct told him to stay on guard. But he had one rule: never let them see you sweat. He finally pulled into the rally, where rows of bikes gleamed under the hot sun. The sound of laughter, classic rock music, and the occasional revving engine filled the air. At first glance, it looked like any other biker meet: patched vests, denim, and the smell of grilled burgers wafting from a food truck. But it didn't take long for the shift to happen. As Marcus removed his helmet and hung it on his handlebars, conversations seemed to stall around him. A group of riders nearby exchanged quick glances, their voices dropping to a murmur. Marcus pretended not to notice. He walked toward the main area, his boots crunching against the gravel, and gave a nod to the first group of bikers he passed. "Nice setup y'all got here," he said, his voice steady but warm. A few of them gave tight-lipped nods, while one older man just stared at him, his expression unreadable. "Don't see many new faces around here," the man finally said, his tone carrying just enough weight to suggest he wasn't talking about new faces in general. "Figured I'd check it out," Marcus replied easily. "Always good to meet fellow riders." The man squinted at him, as if trying to decide whether Marcus was brave, foolish, or both. Marcus held his gaze for a moment before moving on, not giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing him pause. It wasn't long before the whispers started. He could feel eyes on him wherever he went, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. But Marcus kept his focus. He wasn't here to start trouble, but he wasn't going to shrink, either. As he walked past a line of bikes, a group of riders leaned against their machines, watching him like hawks. One of them, a burly man with a red bandana and a patch that read "Road Vultures," stepped forward. "You lost, buddy?" the man asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Marcus stopped, turning to face him with a calm smile. "Don't think so," he said. "Unless you've got a map that says otherwise." A few chuckles rippled through the group, but they weren't friendly. The man stepped closer, his grin widening as he tried to size Marcus up. "We don't usually get your kind around here," he said, loud enough for others nearby to hear. Marcus didn't flinch. He looked the man square in the eyes, his expression unbothered. "Good thing I'm not usual then," he replied. The crowd that had begun to gather around them fell silent. All eyes were on Marcus and the man, the tension thick enough to drown out the noise of the rally. For a moment, it felt like the entire event had come to a standstill. the air crackling with unspoken challenges and unspoken questions. What would happen next? Would Marcus walk away? Would the tension boil over? Or would something completely unexpected unfold? Marcus' hand hovered near the strap of his helmet, his thumb brushing against it. He wasn't thinking about confrontation, he was thinking about something much bigger. And as he took a deep breath, the faintest hint of a knowing smile played at the corners of his lips. Because Marcus Kane had a way of turning even the hardest hearts. But how? This silence hung in the air, charged with an energy that made even the rustling of leaves seem loud. Marcus could feel the weight of every eye on him, each glance carrying its own assumptions, judgments, and unspoken questions. Yet he didn't budge. His calm demeanor wasn't an act. It was armor. He had worn it many times before. In places like this, under circumstances far less inviting. The burly man in the red bandana smirked, sensing the crowd's attention and feeding off it. "You got guts. I'll give you that," he said, his voice thick with challenge. "But guts don't mean much around here unless you've got respect. And respect's gotta be earned." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression still unreadable. "Respect's a two-way street," he said, his tone even. "I've always found it works better when it goes both ways." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some sounded amused, others uneasy. The man in the bandana leaned in just a little closer, his grin now edged with something sharper. "We'll see about that," he said, stepping back and signaling to his crew. For a moment, Marcus wondered if this was going to escalate, but instead, the man barked out a laugh and gestured toward a row of tables set up near the edge of the rally grounds. "You ride?" he asked, though the question was almost mocking. Marcus glanced at his Harley, its sleek frame standing out among the other bikes. "Every chance I get," he replied. "Good," the man said, his grin returning. "Because around here, we don't just talk. We ride to prove what we're made of. There's a stretch of road outside town. A race we run to separate the real riders from the tourists. You in?" The challenge hung in the air like a dare, and Marcus knew there was no backing down. He nodded, his confidence unwavering. "Why not?" he said. The tension in the crowd shifted slightly, turning into a buzz of anticipation. People began to disperse, some heading toward their bikes, others moving to spread the word. Marcus could feel the eyes lingering on him as he walked back to his Harley, the unspoken question on everyone's mind. Who was this guy, and what was he trying to prove? As Marcus swung the leg over his bike, he couldn't help but think about how many times he faced moments like this. Moments where he was judged before anyone knew his story. But what most people didn't realize was that Marcus had been riding for as long as he could remember. His love for the road had been passed down from his father, a man who had spent his weekends tinkering with bikes and his weekdays teaching Marcus lessons about dignity, perseverance, and what it meant to stand tall in a world that often tried to shrink you. His father had always said, "The road doesn't care who you are, son. It'll test you, break you down, and build you back up again. But it's up to you to decide how you carry yourself when it happens." And Marcus had carried himself well. He'd ridden through countless towns, seen the best and worst of people, and found a sense of freedom on the open road that nothing else could match. This rally, this challenge, it wasn't new territory for him, but that didn't mean it was going to be easy. As the riders lined up at the edge of town, the energy crackled like a live wire. The stretch of road ahead was long and winding, a narrow two-lane path that cut through fields and woods before looping back toward the rally grounds. The locals called it the Gauntlet, and from what Marcus had heard in the murmurs and whispers, it wasn't just about speed. It was about navigating sharp curves, sudden dips, and the unspoken pressure of everyone watching. Marcus looked around at the other riders. Most were clearly regulars, exchanging knowing glances and inside jokes as they revved their engines. But a few, like him, seemed newer to the scene, their nerves betrayed by the way they gripped their handlebars or darted their eyes toward the crowd. The man in the red bandana rode up beside Marcus, his bike rumbling like a beast eager to be unleashed. "Last chance to back out," he said, his voice low enough that only Marcus could hear. Marcus turned to him, his face calm but firm. "I didn't come all this way to back out," he replied. The man smirked again, but this time there was something else in his expression, a flicker of curiosity, maybe even respect. "All right then," he said. "Let's see what you've got." The signal to start came suddenly, a sharp whistle that cut through the noise, and the bikes roared to life. Marcus gripped his handlebars and leaned into the first turn, the wind rushing past him as the other riders surged forward. The road ahead was a blur of asphalt, trees, and shadows, each twist and turn demanding his full attention. The first few miles were intense but manageable. Marcus stayed close to the front of the pack, his focus sharp as he navigated the curves and dips with practiced ease. But as the race stretched on, the terrain grew trickier. A sudden curve almost caught him off guard, the gravel on the edge of the road threatening to pull him off course. He corrected quickly, his heart pounding but his hands steady. Behind him, he could hear the roar of engines and the occasional shout as riders jockeyed for position. But Marcus wasn't concerned about winning, not yet anyway. His goal was to ride smart, to show them that he wasn't just another outsider passing through. Up ahead, the road narrowed, forcing the riders into single file. Marcus could see the man in the red bandana just ahead of him, his bike swerving slightly as he navigated the tighter space. Marcus stayed on his tail, waiting for the right moment to make his move. But just as he was about to accelerate, something unexpected happened. A loud crack echoed through the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of a bike skidding out of control. Marcus glanced in his mirror and saw one of the riders behind him veering off the road, their bike tumbling into the grass. The crowd back at the rally would later say it was a miracle that no one was seriously hurt. But in the heat of the moment, Marcus didn't have time to process what had happened. He stayed focused, his eyes on the road ahead and his mind racing with questions. Was the crash an accident, or was it something more? Was this just a race, or was there more at play than he realized? The finish line was still miles away, but Marcus knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about the road anymore. This was about proving something, to himself, to the crowd, and maybe even to the man in the red bandana. And as the next curve loomed ahead, Marcus tightened his grip, the roar of his Harley matching the beat of his heart. This race wasn't over, not by a long shot. The wind howled past Marcus' ears as he leaned into the next curve, his bike gliding over the asphalt with precision. The finish line was still far ahead, but something in his gut told him this race was bigger than just crossing it. The crash he'd seen moments ago still lingered in his mind, the sound of metal hitting gravel playing on a loop. The riders behind him were thinning out, but he didn't dare look back again. The only thing that mattered was what lay ahead. Up front, the man in the red bandana was still in the lead, his bike roaring as he pushed it harder with each turn. Marcus stayed close, keeping just enough distance to avoid trouble but not enough to be forgotten. The road narrowed again, lined with trees that cast long, dancing shadows in the fading light. Suddenly, Marcus noticed something strange. The man in the red bandana was veering slightly to the left, his bike wobbling for a split second before he corrected it. Marcus' sharp eyes caught it right away. A back tire losing air, the faint hiss barely audible over the roar of the engines. Marcus's instincts kicked in. He could gun it now, pass him while the opportunity was ripe, and solidify his position as a serious contender. But then, something his father had told him years ago came rushing back. A man's character isn't measured by what he wins, but by how he helps others when it counts. It would have been easy to ignore it, to let the man figure it out on his own. But Marcus didn't. Instead, he eased off the throttle just enough to pull alongside him. "You've got a flat," Marcus yelled over the noise. The man glanced at him, his face a mix of surprise and suspicion. "I'm fine," he shouted back. But Marcus could see the strain in his grip and the tension in his posture. "No, you're not," Marcus shouted, his voice firm. "If you push it, you'll lose control. Pull over before you crash." For a moment, it looked like the man was going to ignore him. But as his bike wobbled again, the reality of the situation seemed to sink in. With a sharp nod, he veered toward the shoulder of the road, slowing to a stop. Marcus pulled over behind him, cutting the engine and stepping off his bike. The man climbed off his own, frustration written all over his face as he inspected the deflating tire. "Why'd you stop?" he asked, his voice laced with both curiosity and irritation. "You could have kept going." Marcus shrugged, his expression calm but sincere. "Didn't seem right, leaving you back here like this. A race isn't worth it if someone gets hurt." The man stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to figure out if Marcus was for real. Finally, he let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You're a strange one, you know that?" "Maybe," Marcus said, grinning. "But I figured you'd rather finish the race in one piece." Together, they worked to patch the tire enough to make it back to the rally grounds. By the time they returned, the race was already over, and the crowd had gathered to celebrate the winner. Marcus didn't mind. He hadn't come to win a trophy. When they rolled in, heads turned again, but this time the expressions were different. There was no suspicion, no guarded stares. Instead, people moved closer, curiosity etched on their faces. The man in the red bandana climbed off his bike and turned to Marcus, his face unreadable for a moment. Then he extended a hand. As the crowd around them murmured and exchanged glances, the tension that had hung over the rally all day seemed to dissolve. People approached Marcus, some with questions, others with apologies hidden in their small smiles and nods. He spoke to everyone who came his way, sharing stories of his rides, laughing at jokes, and bridging gaps that had seemed impossible just hours ago. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the rally felt like a different place. Marcus stood with the man in the red bandana, now known to him as Rick, and a handful of others who had joined their circle. The conversation flowed easily, and for the first time, Marcus felt the walls of prejudice that had greeted him beginning to crumble. As Marcus prepared to leave, Rick stopped him. "You're welcome here anytime," he said, his tone carrying weight. "Appreciate that," Marcus replied. "But I hope next time, I'm not the only new face you welcome." Rick nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Fair enough." Marcus climbed onto his Harley, the engine roaring to life as he gave the group a final wave. The road stretched out ahead of him, dark and inviting, like a blank canvas waiting for the next story. As he rode away, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet victory, not because he changed the world in one afternoon, but because he planted a seed. Sometimes, that's all it takes to turn the tide. And with the wind in his face and the hum of the engine beneath him, Marcus Kane rode on, knowing the road ahead held endless possibilities.